Danse, my name is Tashina Makokis. I am from Saddle Lake First Nation. I reside in Edmonton, Alberta. I will be reading pages 57 and 58 from the TRC summary in the history section under the assimilation policy. From the Canadian government's perspective, the most significant elements in the treaties were the written provisions by which the First Nations agreed to cede, release, surrender, and yield their land to the Crown. In the treaty negotiations, however, federal officials left the impression that the government intended the treaties to establish a permanent relationship with First Nations. Treaty Commissioner Alexander Morris told the Cree in 1876, "What I trust and hope we will do is not for today and tomorrow only. What I will promise, and what I believe and hope you will take, is to last as long as the sun shines and yonder river flows." In reality, the federal government policy was very different from what Morris said. The intent of the government's policy, which was firmly established in legislation at the time that the treaties had been negotiated, was to assimilate Aboriginal people into broader Canadian society. At the end of this process, Aboriginal people were expected to have ceased to exist as a distinct people with their own governments, cultures, and identities. The Federal Indian Act, first adopted in 1876, like earlier pre-Confederation legislation, defined who was and who was not an Indian under Canadian law. The Act also defined a process through which a person could lose status as an Indian. Women, for example, could lose status simply by marrying a man who did not have status. Men could lose status in a number of ways, including graduating from a university. Upon giving up their status, individuals were also granted a portion of the band's reserve land. First Nations people were unwilling to surrender their Aboriginal identity in this manner. Until 1920, other than women who involuntarily lost their Indian status upon marriage to a non-status individual, only 250 Indians voluntarily gave up their status. In 1920, the federal government amended the Indian Act to give it the power to strip individuals of their status against their will. In explaining the purpose of the amendment to a parliamentary committee, Indian Affairs Deputy Minister Duncan Campbell Scott said that our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill. The other major element in the bill that Scott was referring to empowered the government to compel parents to send their children to residential schools. Residential schooling was always more than simply an educational program. It was an integral part of a conscious policy of cultural genocide. Further evidence of this assault on Aboriginal identity can be found in amendments to the Indian Act banning a variety of Aboriginal cultural and spiritual practices. The two most prominent of these were the West Coast potlatch and the Prairie Thirst Dance, often referred to as the Sun Dance. Residential school principals had been in the forefront of the campaign to ban these ceremonies and also urged the government to enforce the bans once they were put in place. The Aboriginal right to self-government was also undermined. The Indian Act gave the federal government the authority to veto decisions made by band councils and to depose chiefs and councillors. The Act placed restrictions on First Nations farmers' ability to sell their crops and take out loans. Over the years, the government also assumed greater authority as to how reserve land could be disposed of. In some cases, entire reserves were relocated against the will of the residents. The Indian Act was a piece of colonial legislation by which, in the name of protection, one group of people ruled and controlled another.